Well, I'll tell you, the music here is worth the price of admission right there. You don't need to hear me. This is wonderful. And before I get started, I'd just like to have a word of prayer. Most kind and gracious Father in heaven, thank you so much for this place of peace where we can come together and worship you. And we ask that you would let the words that are spoken not be my words, but your words. And let our hearts be prepared to hear your message. I ask in the worthy name of Jesus. Amen. Well, I thought I'd talk a little bit today about who are we as Christians in the society in which we live today. You know, it's becoming a little more difficult these days sometimes to live by Christian principles without being attacked. But didn't Jesus say, if you follow me, you're going to have some trouble? So that really shouldn't be particularly surprising. It should be, in a way, comforting. But, you know, for me, my foundation started right here in the church as a youngster, listening to the mission stories. I used to love those mission stories. They don't do that so much anymore. And it was mostly missionaries and missionary doctors going to Africa and India and all these places and talking to what they call the heathen. Now probably missionaries from those places come here, I suspect. But things have changed a little bit. But you know, progressing on from kindergarten to primary and the primary treasure and figuring out all those little puzzles they had in there, and then the junior guides and all those inspirational stories and little worksheets that they had. But probably the most important thing were so many of the sermons. And I can remember so many sermons that really prepared you and gave you the faith that you were going to need no matter what aspect of life you pursued. But one of the common threads through all of it was care of the vulnerable, care of the needy, care of the poor. And Jesus himself spent a lot of time with the vulnerable people of our society, with the poor people of our society. And I think that is a message for us today. Not to look our nose down at people who aren't doing well and just tell them, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You know, that may be what you did, but it may have been a different circumstance. Everybody has different circumstances. And we have to start thinking about, what would Jesus do? How would Jesus treat poor people, the homeless people, the people who are strung out on drugs, the people who have severe mental illnesses? You know, in Proverbs 14:31, the Bible says, he that oppresses the poor reproacheth his maker. But he that honoreth him has mercy on the poor. Now think about that. Reproaching your maker by oppressing the poor. And what is oppressing the poor? Some people, you know, their minds go back to, you know, medieval Europe with princes and serfs, and they were oppressing the poor. You don't have to go back that far. We have people who oppress the poor right here in our own country. Because it is oppressing the poor when you keep them poor, when you do things that prevent them from climbing the ladder of opportunity. And we all have spheres of influence. We all have the ability to extend a helping hand to somebody in our environment, to somebody in our orbit, to give them that opportunity to be successful. And particularly when we talk about our place in society as Christians, what does James say in the first chapter of James, the 27th verse? Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. The fatherless. In other words, he was talking about people who don't have a positive support system to help themselves. The widows, he's talking about people who have fallen upon hard times. And when he says to visit them, he's not just talking about going and say, "Hi, I visited you." He's talking about helping them, utilizing the resources that you have to actually help them, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Don't be like everybody else. You should be able to be distinguished from there, because this is who you are. That's how we fit in. You know, I can remember poverty so well as a youngster. And I have to admit, I did not like poverty. You know, some people don't like rats, and some people don't like roaches and spiders. I hated poverty. And I can vividly remember when I was in the 5th grade, and every now and then the teacher would say, "Tomorrow there are going to be popcorn balls, and they're a nickel a piece, so if you want to purchase one, bring a nickel." Some kids would bring a dime or a quarter. Some people even brought a whole dollar and bought a whole bag of them. I never had a popcorn ball. We didn't have an extra nickel to spare. And they looked so good, I gotta tell you. There was nothing better than a popcorn ball. But you know what? As life goes on and you can afford a popcorn ball, then they're not that great. Isn't that the way it is with stuff in general? It doesn't matter what it is. Maybe you want a Corvette, or maybe you want a Mercedes. But, you know, when you can afford one, they're not that great, you know? Because it's stuff. And that's what Jesus talked about. You know, don't make your treasures out of this stuff. Your treasure should be in heaven. This is what's really important. Once you come to realize that, stuff doesn't bother you. And you know, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to poverty, compared to God, everybody here lives in poverty. The richest man in the world is no different than the poorest man in the world when you compare them with God and his power and his wealth. And we would do good to remember that, because sometimes people accumulate a little bit of material stuff and they start thinking that they're better than everybody else. And they're not. And what they really should be doing is thanking God for the blessings and being willing to share those blessings with other people. You know, one of the reasons that God instituted a tithe is because he wanted us to be used to the ideal of giving and helping other people. Does he need our tithe? Of course he doesn't. He owns everything. He controls everything. But it gives us an opportunity to start looking at other people with love, with real compassion in their hearts. But I remember as a youngster, I had this giant dream of becoming middle class. It just seemed like so cool to be middle class and to be able to just do stuff like regular people. It's amazing, you know, what we dream about. But my mother had dreams too. Her dream was for me and my brother to be successful. My mother was an extremely attractive woman. There were no end of male suitors. After they got divorced, she was born to a very large family in rural Tennessee, got married when she was 13, trying to escape just horrible circumstances. And had less than a third grade education. And then years later, discovered that her husband, my father, was a bigamist, had another family. And obviously that resulted in a divorce. But she was struggling, trying to keep it all together. And she was a very unusual person. She did not want to be dependent on the government, so she worked very hard, 2-3 jobs at a time as a domestic. She would leave at 5 in the morning, get back after midnight, day after day. Sometimes we only saw her on the weekend because we were in bed when she left and we were in bed when she came home. But she would come home, she would fix our lunch, she would take care of stuff. But we frequently didn't see her. But it was a ploy. Because you see, she wasn't really a domestic. She was a spy. And so she was spying on those people that she was working for because she wanted to know why they were so successful. And why did they live in these beautiful homes? And she concluded that it was because they didn't watch a lot of TV and they read a lot of books. So she came home and she imposed that on me and my brother. And we were not happy campers, I gotta tell you. If it had been today's world, we probably would have called social services on it. But in those days, you had to do what your parents told you to do. So, we started reading those books. And, before that, I was a terrible student. I was the worst student you could imagine. Then I remember one day they were doing eye exams and they discovered that I couldn't see, and I got a pair of glasses. I didn't know anybody could see the board. This was news to me. But suddenly, I could see the board, and I went from an F student to a D student. And I was so pleased with myself. My mother was not happy at all. But, I kept reading those books and learning more and more. And, within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And those same students who were laughing at me and calling me dummy were coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I would say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious. But it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, I had a real revolution in the way that I thought as I read those books. Because I read about scientists and explorers and philosophers and entrepreneurs and all kinds of people. And I began to see some common threads. And I began to recognize that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in the course of life is you. It's not somebody else. People around me were saying, it's those people who are keeping you down. It's this circumstance that's keeping you down. And you know what? Maybe they were trying to keep you down. But I began to understand what my mother was saying when she would say to me, if you walk into an auditorium full of racist, bigoted people, she said, you don't have a problem. They have a problem. Because you see, they're all going to cringe and wonder if you're going to sit next to them, whereas you can go sit anywhere you want. and realize that you do have control in your life. Even if there are people placing obstacles in your way, like a hurdle, every time you jump over one, you get better. It strengthens you. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't make an effort to remove those hurdles. And we all have spheres of influence, and we can demonstrate in those spheres of influence what real love and compassion is. You know, I find it sad that there are still people in our society who look at others and make judgments about them based on their external characteristics. The color of their skin, the texture of their hair, their national origin. Because as a neurosurgeon, when I took someone to the operating room and opened their head, started working on their brain, I couldn't tell what those external characteristics were. Their brains were all the same. And what makes you who you are? Is it your nose or is it your brain? And you know, only people who think very superficially think that they can characterize somebody on the basis of their external characteristics. And we should make that very clear in the spheres of influence in which we live. Well, one of the things that I learned is that reading works much better when it comes to accumulating knowledge than watching television. Because, you know, when you read, you're looking at words all the time. So you learn how to spell. You can always tell a reader because they know how to spell. And people who don't know how to spell, they write real sloppy so you can't tell. Have you noticed that? There's a lot of doctors who can't spell. But, you know, you have to take those words and you make them into sentences so you learn grammar and syntax. And you have to take those sentences and you have to make those into concepts so you learn to use your imagination. You watch television, somebody's already done all that stuff already. So you're not really exercising your brain to the extent that you should be able to. It's one of the reasons that my wife and I and the Carson Scholars Fund put so much emphasis on reading. And we open up reading rooms all over the country. In fact, Candy was here, I think, last week opening up a few reading rooms here in California. There are several here in California. These are incredible places that no young person would pass up, the way that they're decorated. And they get points for every book they read. And they can trade those in for prizes. And in the beginning, they're interested in the prizes, but it doesn't take long before that has a profound effect on their academic performance, which is what we're really trying to do, because research has demonstrated that if a child is reading at grade level, by grade 3, it changes the trajectory of their lives. And their likelihood of finishing school, not dropping out, all of that is impacted significantly. And it's also said that during those first few years, you learn to read. After that, you read to learn. It makes a big difference in what happens to you in life. And that's what we have to begin to emphasize. Instead of going around and making excuses and creating all kinds of problems, let's do things based on what we know. We know that if we cultivate a young person's brain and we give them what they need to become intellectually sufficient, they're going to do okay. They're going to do just fine. And that's why we need to do everything we can to make sure that we have not only a good educational system, but good access for people for education. It's going to be interesting because, you know, we're entering a new phase now of education. it's based on the internet. It's based on people being able to get information much more rapidly than they could before. Have you noticed now that there's no more old people with senior moments? Because all they have to do is pull out their smartphone and find out what it is that they forgot. Okay. But, you know, with education, we are not very far away from virtual reality. People won't even need to go to school. They'll put on their headsets. You know, I've had an opportunity to use some of those virtual reality headsets. It's pretty amazing. I mean, you can be in Greece, you can be in Rome, you can be in Egypt, you can be in your backyard and have a tutorial on how you find the energy source that's coming into your house and open it up, and which things you can move without electrocuting yourself. All of that stuff is readily available, and it's getting even better. Can you imagine what that's going to do to education? Can you imagine what it's going to do for work? In a way, it's good because there won't be so much traffic congestion, because, you know, people can work from wherever they are. But in a way, it's terrible because people are not developing interpersonal relationships with other people the way that they should. And it's something that we're going to have to be very careful of. Parents, particularly of young children, just realize they are being exposed to things that would have been unimaginable when you were a child. Constantly, they're being bombarded with this stuff. And that's why it becomes so vitally important to spend time with your children. Train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. I know some of you are saying, when are they going to get old? But, you know, the fact of the matter is, it is our responsibility to develop the right kind of relationship with them so that they get that solid foundation early on, because they are going to be bombarded in the society that we live in now with a lot of things that are not biblical. And here's where courage comes in. It is very, very easy to just go along with what's politically correct, what everybody says is the right thing. It takes a lot more courage to always do what God says. You know, that was in the Sabbath school lesson today with Daniel. He could easily have closed the doors and not let anybody see him praying. But he was true to his God. And if we are true to God and true to his word and what the Bible says, then we are not going to be swayed when people come along and say, well, yeah, I know it says that in the Bible, but, you know, that was thousands of years ago, and, you know, God is different now, and, you know, this is what it means now. Can I tell you something? God says he changes not. And think about this. The Bible says, to God, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So really, when you say that was thousands of years ago, say it was 2,000 years ago, what's today, Saturday? It was like Thursday, okay, in God's sight. So there's not a lot of impetus or time for him to be changing things. And why would he need to change things? Because he's perfect. He's God. And our challenge is, do we believe that? Or do we believe in man? Do we believe what man tells us? what people say to us. You know, I do not believe in what man says. I guess I should be equal what woman says too. I believe in what God says. And I do not believe in any political party. You know, when people align themselves slavishly to any political ideology, and they place that over their allegiance to God, they have done wrong and they will go in the wrong direction. We must always pledge allegiance to God. And you think about, you know, I was talking about compassion a little while ago. I mean, what is true compassion? Is it finding a poor person and just patting them on the head and say, there, you poor little thing. I'm going to take care of all your needs. Got free stuff for you? Or is it providing a mechanism for that person to develop their God-given talents and develop a life of dignity? Which one is compassion? And when we think about Jesus, and again, I think about him a lot whenever I have a decision to make. Think about some of the parables he told in the Bible. For those who think that we should say, there, you poor little thing, nobody needs to do something, I'll take care of you. Think about the parable of the talents. Who was he very pleased with? Those who took what they had and developed it and used it and grew it, or those who buried it and just said, I just want to make sure that you're happy with me? He wants us to use what he's given us. He's given us these amazing brains. We're made in God's image. You have a brain that has billions and billions of neurons. Hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever done, everything you've ever heard. It's all in there, which is why, remember when you were a little tot, there was a little song, be careful, little eyes, what you see, little ears. All that stuff goes in there. It does not go away. It influences how you act, even at a subconscious level. So you need to be careful. But if you think about what the brain can do, have you ever heard someone say, don't learn this, you're going to clog your brain. You're going to overload your brain. Guess what? You cannot overload the human brain. If you learn one new fact every second, and that's very hard to do, every second it would take you in excess of 3 million years to overload your brain. And I don't know anybody who lives that long, so I don't think you ever need to worry. The next time somebody tells you that you're going to overload your brain, please let them know that. But when I think about real compassion, I think about Jesus. What did he do? Here he is, the creator of the universe, all power and majesty and prestige. With all of that, he humbled himself. He came here as a man. He was humiliated, tortured, and killed. Why? Because he loves us. Think about that. I mean, how are we? God gave his only begotten Son for us. Who are we? I mean, we're slime balls. Think about it. We sin all the time. Some of us think we don't sin, but we do. If you think you don't sin, you're sinning because you're proud. Okay? So it really doesn't matter. We're sinful beings. And that's why he came, to save us. And we all know the verse, John 3:16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son to the world to condemn the world, but the world through him might be saved. What does that tell you? It tells you that he came to save us. He didn't come to condemn us. When I was a kid, somehow I developed this aberrant notion that God was always watching you and writing down every little thing you did so that in the judgment day, he could say, remember on April the 17th what you did? But that's not who God is. God will do anything that he can possibly do to save you. If that means sometimes allowing some difficulty in your life so that you are redirected to him, he will do that. But he knows the beginning from the end. He knows what's necessary. And he will do whatever it takes. And you have to actively resist. Because I believe that God will save anybody who would be happy in heaven. But if you wouldn't be happy in heaven, wouldn't that be torture to be there forever? He loves people enough that he's not going to torture you forever by having you in a place where you're going to be miserable. But we need to get our hearts right and in harmony with him, understanding what, in fact, true compassion is and letting that be the thing that drives us. And doing what is right. When we read John 3:16, think on those words. Whosoever believeth in him. It doesn't say whosoever believeth in him and doesn't eat pork. It doesn't say whosoever believeth in him and belongs to this party or belongs to that party. See, we like to add a lot of stuff on. We don't need to be adding anything to what he says, and we don't need to be taking anything away from what he says. We need to be believing what he says. It will make all the difference in the world. And that will just lead us to do what's right. And that has been, the case throughout my medical career. I would be faced with these challenging situations. I remember one time one of the obstetricians came to me and he says, I have this woman and she's having twins and one of them has a severe case of hydrocephalus and the head is expanding so rapidly that she's going to go into premature labor and both twins will be lost. And can you do an operation on that baby while it's still in the womb? Well, that was before intrauterine surgery was acceptable. In fact, there had been an article in the New England Journal of Medicine saying, we're not ready for this. But here was a situation where not only the baby with the problem was going to be lost, but the other baby was going to be lost too. And as I think about how God honors life, even from conception, I said, Lord, please guide me, show me what needs to be done here. And he guided me to a neurosurgeon in Philadelphia who'd been doing some experiments on sheep with hydrocephalus. And he had actually developed a technique for being able to operate in utero in the sheep that was pregnant. And I said to him, do you think we could modify some of what you did so that we could do this in a human being and we could do it within the next week? Well, you know, what does it say in Philippians 4:13? I can do all things through Christ, which... So I put it in his hands. I said, Lord, can you work this out? He worked it out. And we were able to do the operation. We couldn't do it at Johns Hopkins because the ethics committee took too long. The babies would have been dead by the time they finished. They're sort of like Congress. But at any rate, but at any rate, you know, we did the operation. I could actually see the baby's head go down, shrink right on the ultrasound. We were able to buy several more weeks, and then the babies were born, and it was a big national story. And then the controversy started, and they said it's unethical to operate on babies in utero. But then when it was discovered that not only was the normal baby saved, but the other baby was doing well too, then all the critics said, well, I would have done that too under those circumstances. That's kind of the way it works, you know. And for the young people out there, I'll tell you, you know, when you push the envelope, when you do things sort of outside of the box, expect to be criticized. Okay, that is always going to happen. Don't worry about that if, in fact, you are seeking wisdom and direction from God. That is always the thing that has guided me. I remember there was a little girl from California here. She had a very complex tumor right in the center of her brain. Everybody said it was inoperable. And she ended up at Johns Hopkins. I must say it was a very intimidating situation. But I did operate on her, and she actually survived the operation. She had some deficits. She went back to California. I lost track of her, but last month I was in Las Vegas. Not gambling, by the way. It was business. But and then I was notified that there was a family that wanted to speak to me, and I went over. It was the girl's aunt and uncle. And they just said, we wanted to thank you for operating on our little niece that everybody said was impossible 30 years ago. And I just want you to know she's 35 years old and doing fine, you know. But, you know, listening. But some people said, well, you know, Carson's a hot dog. He does all this stuff. It's not about being a hot dog by any stretch of the imagination. It's about listening to the Lord and listening to his guidance. You know, I go back now that I've retired, and I look at some of the operative notes, and I said, what? You did what? But you know, it really wasn't me. It was him. And it doesn't matter whether you're a neurosurgeon or auto mechanic. It doesn't matter what you are. If you allow God's guidance, he will bless whatever it is that you're doing. And that's what we need to make sure that all of our children know and understand. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding. Your own understanding will always lead you away. And you always acknowledge him in everything you do. You know, when I first got into public life, someone said to me, you know, congratulations, this is all great and well, but you're going to have to stop with all this God stuff because separation of church and state and all this stuff. And I said, it's not going to happen. I said, I will gladly give up anything in government, but I will never give up God. And that is absolutely, please tell me, what is there in government? What is there in Hollywood? What is there in the world of finance that even begins to compare with a relationship with God? And how long are we here? Even if you get to be 100 years old, what is that against the backdrop of eternity? We have to put all of these things in perspective. And that also removes fear. Because even if you're going to be persecuted, how long are you going to be persecuted? Compared to the backdrop of eternity, it really doesn't matter. That's what Paul was talking about when he said all this stuff, I counted as dung. This is nothing. Because he could see what the big picture was. That's what we need to do. Focus on Jesus, not focus on ourselves. You know what happens when you focus on yourself? You get depressed. Okay? Because you're always messing up. Okay, but he never messes up. And therefore, just focus on him because he said, I'm your righteousness. It is me and not you. And if that's what it means when it says, whosoever believeth in him. We believe in him. If we worry all the time about ourselves, it means we don't think that what he did was good enough to save us. And he said, all you have to do is come to me, believe in me, accept me. Now, some people say, so if I believe in God, it just means I can be any kind of person I want to be? Well, you know what? I'll give you a good example. When you get married, you take wedding vows. And oftentimes they're flowery, they're beautiful, wonderful. But do you have to consult them all the time? Let's see, what did it say now that time? Not if you love your spouse. You don't have to consult the wedding vows because your actions demonstrate that you love your spouse. And when you believe in him and accept him, the very same thing happens. He becomes your center. All of your orientation is toward him. Your orientation is not toward another human being or some human ideology. It is only about him. And that's the only thing that keeps us moving in the right direction. But we all have a sphere of influence. And I want that to be the takeaway message. You can influence people around you by the way that you live, by the way that you treat other people. I always tell the people around me when it comes to difficult decisions, just do the right thing. Don't worry about the political implications of this or that or the other. Do what is right. And when you do what is right, there's an added advantage. People may accuse you of all kind of stuff, but they will never find anything because there's nothing to find. And that really alleviates a lot of tension in your life. God gave us commandments. He gave us directions. Why? Because he loves us. He made us. He knows how we work. And think about it. If he didn't love us, he would just go ahead and do whatever you want. Doesn't matter. He wants us to get the most out of life. He actually wants us to be happy. Some people think he wants us to be acidic, and no, not at all. He wants us to be happy people. A person who loves God can be happy under any circumstances. You should be able to tell them because they treat other people the right. You'll never see them bad-mouthing other people and saying horrible things. It will never happen. That's one of the ways that you can tell somebody who is constrained by the love of Christ. But I just want to end with this one last story that helped me so much. That is, as a young attending neurosurgeon, I had a young man who came to me from Georgia. He was 4 years old. He had been diagnosed with a malignant brainstem tumor, had seen multiple specialists. Everybody told the family, just take him home and let him die, keep him comfortable. And they ended up at Hopkins. And I saw him the first time. He was barely moving, barely breathing, eyes crossed, foaming at the mouth. I said, what am I supposed to do here? And I looked at the CAT scan, and there was big, ugly brainstem tumor. And the parents said, Doctor, we were directed here by the Lord because we would find a neurosurgeon, a Christian neurosurgeon, who could help our son. And the Lord is going to heal our son, and he's going to use you to do it. And I said, that's nice. I said, but this is a malignant brainstem tumor. This is an inoperable tumor. There's nothing I or anybody can do about this. And they said, but doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son. I said, look, MRIs were brand new. I said, let's get an MRI. Maybe it'll show something the CAT scan doesn't show. Did the MRI, had all the radiologists look at it. They said, malignant brainstem tumor, nothing you can do. I told the parents. They said, but doctor, the Lord. I said, well, 1 in 1,000 times the scans are wrong, so maybe it's something else. I'll biopsy it. I opened it up, got a piece, sent it to the pathologist. It came back high-grade glioma, a very malignant tumor. I took out as much as I dared, closed them up, went out and spoke to them. I said, I'm sorry, it looks like it's what we thought. And, you know, only the Lord knows how long a person should be here. Maybe he's already served his purpose, and we'll understand it better by and by, all the things we always tell people. And they said, thank you, doctor, but the Lord. And as I walked away, I said, I've never seen people with this kind of faith. But I expected him to deteriorate and die. But instead, he got better. The next day, he was no longer foaming at the mouth. And his eyes were starting to look in the same direction. And I said, what? And I said, let's do another MRI. And there was still an ugly tumor, but there was a little rim of tissue. And I said, is it possible that maybe this is outside the brainstem and it's compressing the brainstem? And maybe I should go back in? And they said, by all means. And I went back in, and the whole nature of the thing had changed, and I pulled it away layer by layer under the microscope, got to the last layer. There was a glistening white brainstem intact. Long story short, that boy walked out of the hospital and today is a minister. But you know, one of the oncologists said to me, Ben, I've always been an atheist, but I'm a believer now. But it was really for me, because I thought I was doing all this stuff. And after that, I realized it wasn't me. It was God. And this is what we must teach our young people. Let God be the one who is in charge. Because, I'll allude to it again, Philippians 4:13. What does it say? I can do all. Or does it say, I can do some things? Does it say, I can do many things? Most things? All things. Because we serve a mighty God. God bless.
Days are filled with sorrows and cares, hearts often lonely and dread. But burdens are lifted at Calvary, for Jesus